Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So today's podcast is with a guy by the name of Byas. I met him through another interview that I did a while back with a guy by the name of Peter Enns, who has his own website and writes a blog and wrote a book called The Bible Tells Me So. This is Peter Enns, who introduced me to Jared and said, David, you got to meet this guy. This guy, Jared's, you're going to love this interview. You got to stay tuned. You got to listen in. So much we got into. We talked about religion, and we talked about evolution and Genesis for normal people. We talked about Nietzsche and Gilles Deleuze, some I guess you could call them postmodern thinkers, I suppose. I hope that's okay with you, Jared. And we talked about relationships and about education for him being the two connecting points to pretty much everything he does. And I think it probably affects how he parents and how he consults. He's a leadership consultant, and he's working in a very sort of niche market, it seems to me, with family businesses. So Jared's a super cool guy. He's got a lot to offer. You're going to love this interview. So it ends rather abruptly, so we're going to do a part two, but I'd realized we'd hit about the 45-minute mark and we needed to wrap things up. So check out the podcast. Got a lot from TIFF online, davidpecklive.com, and don't forget to pick up your copy of Real Change is Incremental. Well, welcome to Face to Face. It is a beautiful sunny day here just outside of Toronto, and we've got a very special guest with us today. Byas is joining us from, where the heck are you joining us from, Jared?
I often just say north of Philadelphia, because then it sounds like Philadelphia when really it's not. It
sounds pretty lofty place, like
exactly.
It's just north of suburbs, something like that. Well, anyway, listen, thank you for joining us today. You are a really interesting guy. As I read your bio, as I do a little bit of research on you online, you've taught philosophy, a professor. You were a teaching pastor for over a decade, I think. You've taught in philosophy, ethics, biblical studies. You've written a book with Peter Enns called Genesis for Normal People, which when I saw that made me laugh out loud. And now you're kind of a leadership consultant. Is that yeah? So you're a pretty well-rounded guy. How do you stay sane?
How do I stay sane?
Large quantities of Russian vodka?
Yeah. No, actually, no, small quantities.
Small quantities.
I don't want to overdo it, but
that's right.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think kind of what's kept me sane is being able to jump from thing to thing. I learned the hard way that I'm a generalist. It may not sound like that as you kind of jumped to some of those things I've done. That doesn't sound like a generalist thing, but what I learned about myself is I get bored pretty quickly in a certain area. And so voracious in terms of consuming information, and once we get to the nitpicky sort of details of a certain field, I realize I don't do well with that. And I learned that in kind of a THM PhD program when they told me the requirements, and I said, "Are you kidding me? Like I have to spend how much time on what particular small nuanced part of 2 Samuel?" And eventually ended up quitting that program. And my wife jokes and says that's probably her proudest moment of me is when I quit that program.
It's a pretty funny thing to be proud of. That's awesome. And so what was it about it? Is it just the minutia that you get bored with, or is it?
Right. Well, I think the main thing is that I'm most passionate in my most earnest moments about people and about being helpful. And the more I sat in an office with dozens of books around me and realized that at the end of this, maybe 4 people are going to read this, it became clear to me that doesn't light my fire. I wasn't excited about that. And so my vision for myself after that was to say, how can I partner up with really brilliant people and make an impact in a larger audience. And that's really the culmination of that was being able to partner with my friend Pete on Genesis for Normal People. It was exactly the vision I had when I sat down in that office and decided to quit that program. So it really worked well.
So before I ask you what, pray tell, DVFBC is, would you call yourself religious? Are you a Christian? Are you a Protestant? Where do you land?
Yeah, I would absolutely say I'm a Christian. I would venture even to say, so far as to say I'm an evangelical Christian, though my caveat always is that most of my friends who identify as evangelical, and some of them who identify as Christian, might not agree with me on that.
Right.
So we'll have to leave that up for debate. But for me, I would identify for myself as a Christian and as an evangelical Christian, and I take pride in that as part of my identity, as much as I also cringe at it sometimes.
Right. Right. Is that sort of how you and so Peter? So tell me a little bit about Peter Enns. He and I spoke recently on a radio show. He's written a book called The Bible Tells Me So. He's got a new book coming out soon called The Sin of Certainty, which sounds great. Tell me a little bit about that relationship, and then I want to get to your crazy acronym.
Yeah. So Pete was my professor of mine when I was at Westminster, and he really intimidated me. I don't think I ever talked to him when I was in the program. He scared me, and so but then somehow we connected. I was a pastor. Pete and I live about 10 minutes down the road from each other, and when I was a pastor, after I'd graduated and was teaching, contacted me and said, "Hey, I'm looking for kind of gigs and want to talk about the Bible and I want to do it in churches." And so I brought him into our congregation and had him teach on Exodus. He had written the NIVAC commentary on Exodus, and we were going through Exodus, so it was a perfect matchup. And his experience at Westminster was similar to my experience at the congregation where I was serving at the time, and so he and I just really hit it off. I don't know his side of the story, but I really connected with his story. He was 6 months ahead of me in this journey of, kind of the wilderness journey of being outed by an organization that you really loved and had committed yourself to for quite some time, and starting to feel like an outsider in. And so just, he gave me kind of a way forward, and we met for coffee often, and so that's kind of how that connection happened. And then I ended up moving to Arizona to teach, and then the opportunity came up with Genesis, and he asked if I would consider it, and I was absolutely in love with the idea of it, and so went from there, and that just helped solidify the friendship with thousands and thousands of edits and emails and all of that. So just really grateful for Pete and how I feel like he's invested in me. And now
you're writing for his blog?
Yeah, and now I write weekly for PeteEnns.com. Yep.
Cool. Neat. So before we get into Genesis for Normal People, I actually want to talk about the abnormal people.
Okay.
Partially. I'm sure we'll have to talk about both. But tell me about the consulting firm that you work with, because I mean, I'm starting to see the threads, that's for sure. I'm sure you've looked back to see the connecting points and the dots and so on. But tell me what it stands for, and then you're into business education. But what does that mean?
Right. So I currently work as an advisor, a business advisor for Delaware Valley Family Business Center. And so the connecting dot really is 2011 to 2015. I had started another company in marketing and communications, and so a partner and I we were communications consultants, and then we had a creative team who did a lot of designing and development work, web design, web development. And so that where my passion for kind of the nuts and bolts of organizational development and leadership, they were there, they were latent as I was a pastor and as a professor, and this business was really just a playground for me to develop and to explore all of that, where I felt like at the university and at the church, as you might know, organizationally they're about the hardest things to penetrate. And so in terms of leadership or change or experimentation, so I felt like looking back, I was trying to bring those things as a pastor, I was trying to bring that as a professor, and I kept hitting walls. And so the business world was just a breath of fresh air for me to be able to explore and say, hey, I tried this, and no one was there to sort of slap my hand or say this isn't how we do it, or kind of bringing doomsday proclamations if we do it differently. And so I was kind of addicted to that freedom.
Right.
And so we grew that company, which led us, my family and I, to moving back to the East Coast and
somewhere north of Philadelphia.
Yeah, actually to Virginia.
Okay.
So we moved around quite a bit, and so that's where that connected. And then it got to be a little bit too much for me. I have 4 little kids at home, a lot of travel involved with that. My business partner left and went to do something else, so I was in charge of everything, and it just got to be a little overwhelming for me, and I wasn't being able to be at home like I wanted. So I was offered a position here at Delaware Valley Family Business Center, and the unique thing there is it ties together in some, almost more perfectly than I could imagine, the 3 areas of my past in terms of education, in terms of pastoral ministry, and then business.
So are you working mostly with individuals or with family businesses?
I almost exclusively with family businesses, and working with the owners of those businesses and doing management development, team development, leadership development, facilitating meetings amongst partners to help them come to alignment. And it's just great for me because it's a third education, and it's a third relationships, and really helping them address some of the latent things that they aren't going to really want to talk about, and then the business aspect as well.
Jared, do you ever find as a consultant that you're being paid to be dishonest?
Tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I don't really want to hear the truth. I just want you to validate what I'm currently doing and tell this guy across the table from me that he's got to agree with me and sign on the dotted line.
Right, yeah, so it's funny, I just had a conversation with a colleague about that the other day. That's gotten me in trouble in more than one time.
I'm convinced I've lost contracts over it.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely convinced that people do not want to hear, or at least they don't want to know, they don't want to see they're not interested in my insight through my lens because it might just be a little too, they would say harsh, I would say clear.
Right. Well, maybe where my philosophy background really helps here is, I try to, I think it's Emily Dickinson who says, tell the truth, but tell it slant.
Yeah, tell it slant, yeah.
And so I lead with questions. So I almost never want to give my insight. I almost want to back them into the insight on their own accord. So as often as I can lead with questions that get them to where I think they should go, that's always the challenge for me. That's the puzzle for me of every case. So yeah, I do, and I've gotten into trouble with basically clients thinking that I'm sort of their guy, rather than their brother or their sister, whoever else it is. And I always have to say, I'm not sure who you think my client is, but my client is your business, the whole thing, the whole system. It's not you, it's not your brother, it's not your parents, and so that does get me in trouble sometimes for sure.
So tell me, so you're a consultant, you've taught, you're a professor, you're clearly very well read, you're into education. So 2 things I'm picking up, education and relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Seem to be a real thing for you, which I think is really cool. I think I can say the same. I think I'm actually, it's interesting what you say about the PhD, because I'm actually meeting on Wednesday for the 4th time with a potential advisor to consider doing a PhD in ethics.
Ethics, huh?
Ethics, yeah. My background's philosophy, so there's a lot of similarities there, and I just sort of went to sitting in this horrible postmodernist gas chamber of a building in a room with a bunch of books, and how you said, I just had this moment and realized, hey, this isn't really for me. 4 people are going to read this thing. Yep. So it's just kind of maybe a little bit frightening hearing you say it quite the way you've said it. But I think I find your past really quite quite fascinating. It's not just eclectic by the sounds of it for the sake of it, if you know what I mean, Jared. There is a bigger picture here, and I'm wondering if it has to do with this. I don't know. Would you call it a reformation in Christianity? Would you call it some sort of a theological just theological innovations that are occurring? You know, you've got people writing, you know, Peter and Derek Flood. I mean, there's so much kind of going on right now. Rachel Held Evans and so on. I was reading in a journal, sorry for bringing up my academic side here this morning, but I was reading in a journal a couple of days ago about how when the Impressionists came out in the late 1800s, 1874, there was I'm just going to find it. His name is Louis Leroy. An art critic for the weekly paper in Paris. You know, we're talking about Manet and Degas and Renoir and Monet and Cézanne and so on, and he actually refers to their work as being outrageous, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, having not read Genesis for Normal People, but having read Peter and Derek and McLaren and so many you know, I guess you could say this generation of new thinkers in evangelical Christianity. Is there a shift occurring like that we're going to look back on, that people are calling outrageous today, and 100 years from now people are going to go abracadabra?
Yeah.
The short answer is yes.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, how innovative it is probably kind of relative, but I think I guess my fear is not the innovation, but what happens after the innovation, where there's sort of this settling down back into cliques. I think that just seems to be sort of, there's an innovation and then there's a stop. Like, you know, with companies and anyone I've seen, they have one or two innovations in them, and then they revert back to a way of being in the world that's not really open to that anymore. And a lot of that is, you know, socialization and the pressure of, you know, you see it with Emergent, and I love a lot of the guys who started Emergent, and but you see this kind of innovation, and then they get a tribe, and then it kind of crystallizes or becomes calcified, and then you know, what do you want to, how do you keep from that happening? And so, you know, for me, I love that you use the word outrageous. And because I think that's where I find home for me, is always on the margin theologically of the outrageous. And probably the most influential philosopher for me is Gilles Deleuze.
Wow. Okay.
And so I really like, I love reading Deleuze and the imagination he provides for me in how we continue to be pioneers and continue to be pushing the bounds, and so that's how I would answer that. Is there an innovation? Yes. I think my fear is within a framework of still sort of this absolutism or theological objectivity. You innovate, but you innovate it because you think you got it right. Right.
So it's just sort of another form of reductionism on another. It's like on the other side of the coin, as it were.
Right. Exactly. So it's still in the same system or framework, and that frustrates me. I'd rather say, what's a better way of being in the world where we're just okay being in the desert? That God is in the desert. God's not in the establishment of Israel. God's not in the establishment of Egypt. While those have their pros and cons, but what does it mean to just stay in the desert and be looking for different lines of flight, as Deleuze might say?
Yeah, so there's almost like a faith in the chaos of the average and the everyday.
Right, absolutely. I love that phrase.
Do you still think that, I was going to say Christianity, but I think we can say pretty much religions across the board. I've just come back from Cambodia and was a part of a very intimate Buddhist ceremony in a pagoda outside of Siem Reap. I mean, talk about a privilege and a blessing to really be a part of this. And we actually were able to film some of it as well, which on a certain level was offensive to me, and yet the high level monk was totally okay with it. And so at one point, I just went and I grabbed our guy, Sean, and I said, okay, listen, we got to go. I can't stand here and work with you on this any longer. And he actually thanked me later. Because
wow.
Sean says because he felt too like we had crossed a line. And so and yet we had permission. So it's not like we just sort of barged in there, these two white young guys with, well, not so young, but with a camera, and just assumed that we could film, right?
Right.
Anyway, I guess, coming out of that and seeing some of the foundationalism there, the inability to budge and to move, and almost the anti-relational edge. I mean, do you think that's kind of a fault of religion across the board? This absolutism, this I don't know, Cartesian kind of look at the world that says things are this way. Now it's time to move on. So we've got the answer. 2 + 2 = 4. Let's move on to something else. That's already done. Finished.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I see the same. I wouldn't say it's religion because, a lot of the conversation in some of the, circles where I'm conversant, it's also a scientism.
Yeah, sure.
You can swing that way within that as well. So that makes me want to push it under that sort of ideological level and talk about it even biologically or sociologically. I mean, it's human. I don't want to say human nature. I try to avoid that phrase.
Yeah, me too.
I think there's something about how we operate as a culture and societies, even globally. I think there's something under it, and I think religion is a good way that our fears and insecurities and our way of being, it gets formed, and that's how, in religions it manifests there, just as it manifests in science. It manifests everywhere, but I think those are symptomatic of other things.
You're absolutely right. It really does manifest everywhere, doesn't it? It's easy to throw stones at the religious leaders of the day and old sacred texts and so on. But hang on a minute, it's pretty much across the board.
Right. And I think one of the fortunate things about me being in business the last 5 years, I get to see these things operate outside of such a heated context. It's very easy to sort of generalize religion or science, good, bad, but when we're talking and dealing with, businesses and relationships, and you see the same patterns, it just gives you a little more grace for all those ideologies and systems. It's so easy for us to blame those rather than looking more inwardly at ourselves, but also just in our relationships and psychologically, and how we need oftentimes to defend against the harsh realities of life and how we cope. And I think those are all worthwhile pursuits, more than finger pointing at scientism, more than finger pointing at religion. It's looking at those and saying, what are those symptoms of, and how do we address those in our local communities, in myself, in my family? Those are more interesting questions to me than the ideology. For me, needs to point to something else for it to be interesting.
I guess there's a sense in which it's not so much a problem with religion. It really is a philosophical problem in a sense, isn't it? It is a part of being human. It's not genetic or driven by our DNA necessarily, but it does seem to be a part of who we are. We acquiesce. We tend towards the answer, the solution, the narrative kind of wrap up at the end of the 2.5-hour film.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And how much of that is a product of our Western thought? I love that you brought in sort of a Buddhist experience from the East. That may be, I do think the East, my dad lived in Thailand.
Oh, okay.
in a village near Aranya Pathet there. And his experiences, very Buddhist village, helped me in his stories talking through how the Eastern mind can really, I think, help some of our Western dogmatism, where we don't even see it. It's the air we breathe, the water we swim in, and we don't understand. There's a different way of conceiving of the world and our relationship to it that we didn't even know was possible. So, I'm a big proponent of possibilities, and I think for me, the phrase, one of my favorite phrases is, "With God, all things are possible," and I love what I've sort of infused that with some Nietzsche and some Deleuze. And it really is a powerful thing to think about. And it's powerful in the sense that it's frightening, but also powerful in the sense that the way things are isn't the way things have to be.
It's cool. Is that where your friends no longer call you an evangelical when you start taking phrases like that and throwing in a little Nietzsche and a little Deleuze?
Yeah, probably.
Maybe a little Slavoj Žižek along the way. Is that
a little Žižek? Yeah, exactly. I'd say that's precisely where I get myself into trouble a little bit. But I'm kind of okay with that trouble.
Yeah, no, I bet you are. Well, I mean, the comment you made about sort of standing on the edges, sort of theologically. I love I'm a big proponent of possibilities. You could probably make a lot of money selling that T-shirt. Talk to me a bit more about that.
Well, one of the things when I taught philosophy, I taught ethics, and one of the exercises we had talked about was we talked a lot about Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and how he was sort of trying to deconstruct, to use an overused word, the idea that we have a specific nature, we're largely determined, and talking about the possibilities of what it means to sort of break out of that and think about the choices we have. How do we take responsibility for our choices?
Right.
And responsibility for our freedom. And so we would do this really practically with my students, where we would go through their day and we would talk about the choices they felt like they didn't have. And we just kept digging into that until they realized, oh, so my choice was, instead of, telling my friend I can't go have dinner with you because I have a lot of homework, that's actually not true. The reality is I could do that, but I don't want to live with the consequences. Or
right.
Some of the reality is I don't want to be honest with my friend and say, I just don't want to hang out with you.
Yeah.
Like, what would it look like for that possibility?
Yeah, sure.
To have an intimate relationship where we're not making excuses and throwing the get-out-of-jail-free card, to talk about Monopoly a little bit.
Sure.
Of I'm busy. That's a catch-all that keeps us dishonest, and there's something that's enslaving about that dishonesty. So for me, possibilities isn't abstract. It's very concrete around our everyday relationships. So there's that, and then the other side I talked about with our students was, a lot of times with athletes, you see the I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Philippians 4:13 is on their cleats or their shirt. And so my joke often is, so I can do all things. That means you could lose too. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes we cut off half of the possibilities in our theology, that somehow only the good things. When we say all things are possible with God, we kind of slip in there a caveat that says, only the good things.
Right, right.
But what would it be to broaden the idea of the sovereignty of God, or that God's in control of all things, to this sort of terrifying place of, with God all things are possible. Do you really want to go there? That's a lot of freedom. That's a lot of responsibility. That's a lot of negative.
Yeah, without a doubt, you've just really given us a quick course in modern existentialism, it seems to me. Right?
Yeah, right.
Freedom, choice, responsibility. Now what the hell are you going to do with it?
Right, exactly. And so where does God fit in that is I think, an important question. I think I'm less interested in that a lot of times and more interested in how our words and our language as evangelicals betray our theological commitment. That we say one thing, we really mean something else. And how can we be more, to throw out the fourth modern existential buzzword, how can we be more authentic in our existence? So,
well, I mean, it's really interesting. So I wanted to go down that, you used the phrase, there's something enslaving about that kind of dishonesty, and immediately I thought of the word authenticity. And one of my favorite French philosophers is Levinas, who talks a lot about the other and about ethics kind of coming out of our not only our responsibility towards the other, but I guess our recognition of the other as well. And most of my listeners will have heard me talk about this idea of ethics being grounded in the face. The face speaks, and the face speaks, he says, and what it says is, "Thou shalt not kill," which is a profound statement for this guy who lost his family in Auschwitz. He opens totality and infinity up by saying all religion, all philosophy has failed. So So it's, for me, I think, going to be one of those thoughts that I will continue to reflect on for the rest of my life. And I think that's where I'm heading with my PhD in relation to trust and ethics and so on. I'm throwing it all in there because I think between what you're saying and what a little bit of what I'm saying here, this idea of authenticity, I think is sorely lacking from, frankly, being human. I think it's lacking from the corporate world. It's lacking in the nonprofit sector. It's lacking in politics. I mean, we just had a massive landslide victory for the Liberals here in Canada because of Justin Trudeau. He's young, and I mean, starting to read some of the critics, and it looks like it's tied to authenticity, or at least, Jared, an apparent authenticity. And he says, we want real change. We need to listen, not like Prime Minister Harper did. You know, he pushed you guys out. I'm here to embrace. I'm here to include. And I think Canadians really resonated with that. And I think we all do. So why is it so difficult? I don't know what question I'm asking you here, but I'm having a great time trying to formulate it.
Good.
You know, why is it so hard to be honest? You know, you're saying the guy, you know, you're talking with your students, and you know, maybe if they're, you know, you look at it another way, it's really, I actually just don't want to spend time with you tonight. That's why I'm not available for dinner, because I'd rather watch a movie or reruns of the Rockford Files, or whatever. Why?
Yeah, I think
is
there's
it
a
so
lot of
tough?
influences there, but I would mention, you know, I read some articles on the Canadian political climate there, and I think it's mirrored in America. You know, I have a lot of my progressive friends who can't believe that Donald Trump is in the running, and for me, it's precisely that. Why wouldn't he be in the running? It
Which is just,
again, if we look at like the container of his ideology, the content of what he's saying is not that important. It's that he's willing to seem foolish. It's that he's willing to speak his mind and be honest. And the same, I think, with Bernie Sanders on the other sort of side of the aisle. Neither one of them, the content is way less important, I think, than the container. Their way of being, the way that they are communicating, and it is very refreshing, and I respect Donald Trump for that. I respect Bernie Sanders for that they're bringing something fresh in the way they're talking. It's not their policies. It is they're bringing something authentic, which there's something to say for.
Do you think it's what we're all looking for? I mean, I think on some level, you know, people resonate, it seems to me. My students, I think, resonate with an approach in the classroom that's a little more open, that's a little more conversational. Not every student. Some students just want to be told what to know. Give me the PowerPoint slides. What's on the test? Holy smokes, you mean you actually want to talk to me? You want to have a dialogue? Okay, that's a little threatening. Right?
Yeah, I had a student once who got up and yelled at me in the middle of class and walked out. And what he yelled at me was, "Would you please just tell us the blank answer?"
Oh,
He got up and screamed that in the middle of class and walked out.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, one of these days it's going to happen to me, I think, too, because I will not. And I teach in development, and I mean, it's I'm trying to do development while I'm teaching it, if that makes any sense at all, you know.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yep.
But wow, that's so. How did you respond to that?
Well, he walked out, and so I didn't respond really at all. I think I did say, if anyone else feels like that, you know, you're free to leave now, so it'll be less awkward if you do.
Yeah.
But afterward, actually, he apologized and he came back, and I think that's the grace and the patience. To realize people, there's a reason we live out the narrative of other people. There's a reason we feel trapped and we stay trapped, because there's something really safe about living a narrative that we've been taught rather than finding our own way. And being really gracious and patient with people to realize we have our idolatries for a reason, and it's not my position nor my responsibility to rip that from people. But to give them something where they can wean themselves off of it, which is often a sense of self, a sense of trust, and trust in God, trust in themselves as well. I love Calvin's, he opens up the Institutes with, in order to know God, you have to know yourself. In order to know yourself, you have to know God. And so those are way more intertwined than I think we give credit for in Christian circles. But I think I always want to respond with absolute grace and patience, because I know the road is long and it's winding and it's slow.
Well, you talked about the desert earlier, right? And if
Right.
the desert is more of what we're involved in than the oasis, then it seems to me that grace is not only a defining characteristic of Christianity, but essential for relationships.
Where leaders have to be careful, I think, is in taking on the role of being the new narrative for people. So if you think about one of the interesting paradoxes of celebrityism in Christianity, is the more and more people want authenticity, the people who are speaking about authenticity are the people who get held up as a celebrity. And if you aren't careful, that just becomes the new narrative that people take on for themselves. So they're inauthentically heralding authenticity, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so, I love the phrase. I first heard it from Peter Rollins, I think, but the best leader is the one who refuses to lead. And that stays at the forefront of my mind often, is when people want to foist on you responsibility for their life, you have to be strong enough to resist it and to push it back down.
Well, isn't this connected to your idea of possibility? There's this sense of openness. There's this sense of being creative and artistic and not absolute.
Absolutely, yeah. I think absolutely. That's the thing. A few years ago, I was asked to speak at Wild Goose Festival in North Carolina, and that was my topic, was around creativity and possibility. And I think that's precisely it, is if you're looking for me to be objective and to tell you what the right thing to do is or what way to go, I'm limiting your ability to live out your full potential. Now, what I can do is create structures, help you see, avenues for that, and to ask a ton of questions.
Yeah.
And I think one of the best things I can do is refuse to do that for you.
Well, what you've just defined is bad parenting.
Say more.
You just defined bad parenting, because it seemed to me, or maybe good parenting, but, I've got a 10-year-old, I've got a 7-year-old, and it just, as you were talking about that, it took me to conversations with Spencer and Victoria, and how I'm trying to be as honest and open, as authentic as I can be with them, within certain, I suppose, respectable frameworks, whatever the heck that means, but at the same time trying to be as open and honest with them, and asking a ton of questions so they can realize themselves.
Right.
They can figure out the outcome. They can say, "Holy smokes, this is a possible world,"
absolutely.
I've got to figure out how to be comfortable in that, and I've got to figure out how to make my own decisions, because I think parents do it too much for us. Schools do it too much for us. I mean, this is Foucault on ideology in schools, and this is what I'm trying to break out of when I'm teaching and saying, hang on, I want to talk about this with you guys. So sure, we've got a definition here. I do this exercise, Jared, where let's define sustainable development. And honestly, we do 75 minutes on sustainable development, and I got 3 whiteboards full. And then I say to the students, okay, now turn with me to the OECD's definition of sustainable development. And then we put it up and it's the one time I use a PowerPoint slide and a screen in the classroom, and I say, now, which one's better? And the 75-minute conversation, I mean, I think it's case in point. It's nuanced, it's subtle, it's perspectival, it's intersubjective, it's relational, it's all those things that the OECD's definition isn't,
Right. And I think go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head for me there. It's I love these interviews, because I hope other people do too, but I got to tell you, I learned so much by interviewing brilliant people like yourself. Honestly, it's marvelous. So thanks for that.
Well, thank you. I think the other thing I would add, though, from our perspective as leaders in that, is the other thing it is, besides intersubjective and all those other wonderful words, is it's really hard, and it's slow, and it's inefficient, and it's painful, and it's awkward.
It's inefficient. Did you say it's inefficient?
Yes, it is.
It's very funny. Yeah.
So I think those are the kind of things we have to also deal with, because it's easy to see the positive, but if we aren't willing to sort of name reality, that my whole way of seeing the world has to change. I can't be in a hurry in my parenting I can't be having to go run, and it gets so practical for me. I can't be running my kids to 4 activities or 5 activities each per week and be able to have that kind of patience and space where we can have those conversations. Because I can't question you into your own reality if what I need to do is get you to karate. So
That's
I'll ask some
right.
questions, I'll tell you the answer, get your shoes on, let's go.
Yeah, and then bookending it with ballet. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, how might we as leaders be working on our own selves and our own
It's good.
way of being in the world that allows for that? Because often what we need is more space in our life.
It's good.
For those kind of conversations.
So how come? So Genesis. Let's as we believe it or not, come sort of to near the end of the
wow.
interview. I know it's crazy. We're almost at 40 minutes, and we're clearly going to have to do part 2, Jared. It's Genesis for Normal People is the subtitle, A Guide to the Most Controversial, Misunderstood, and Abused Book of the Bible, co-written with Peter Enns. It's an ebook by Patheos Press, available online. And when I put up the podcast, I'll put a link to the book and so on. Why is it Genesis for normal people? Is there that many abnormal people out there? Or tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, if we had $1 for every time someone said, "But I'm a normal person," when we talk about the book. I'm sorry, but I'm an abnormal person.
Right.
So, for us, it was really, N.T. Wright has a series on the New Testament. I think the New Testament for everyone.
Okay. Yep.
And so that's kind of what the idea was. It's just taking, our own.
Oh, having a bit of fun with it, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but
no,
I think
for
it's
sure.
really just. I think the core concept was, there's been a lot of development in biblical research,
Sure.
And yet other theories on Genesis and origins, the ones that get propagated the most tend to be of a more conservative or more traditional approach. And if you want to really understand where biblical scholarship has gone on Genesis in the last 50 years, 100 years, you really have to go to the academic sources. There's not a lot of, quote, for normal people resources out there.
Right.
So that was really our task, was how do we take this scholarship and create a book for everyday people that doesn't have to be bogged down in controversy. One of the criticisms we get in the book is, well, you don't lay out any other alternatives. Well, yeah, it's a book for normal people. A lot of books on these don't, and that's not the point, because once we do that, we get in this academic dialogue and we miss our whole audience. So, so that was our primary point for that, and where the normal people part of it came.
I mean, I guess it's an attempt at, hopefully, I guess, correcting, would you say, maybe this is a polarized way of putting it, but correcting some wrongs or some...
Yeah.
Sorry about that. That's a really poor way of putting it.
Pete might be, he might answer that differently.
Yeah.
Again, I don't necessarily like the correcting wrongs.
Yeah.
I think creating alternatives.
Yeah, good.
And giving people a space to say, hey, something didn't sit right with me on how I read Genesis this way. This sits a lot better. Thank you for articulating it in a way I never could.
Mm-hmm. Why is it, Jared, that so much of this kind of work, this kind of scholarship, having just recently also interviewed Derek Flood, and some of the stuff that Brian McLaren's done, even some of the stuff that Tony Campolo has recently been thinking about and talking about when it comes to questions of sexuality, when it comes to questions about these metaphysical questions, which is so ironic to me. But anyway, when it comes to these types of things, it seems most of us are kind of scared shitless of where it might go.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you said it that way, because I think it is fear. And again, that's where for me, my passion is less around battling ideologies and more at getting to the heart of why we care so much. What needs are being met by me holding on to this ideology? What relationships are at stake if I were to change my mind on these? And I think those, you get at those, and then the shifts, one way or the other, shifting back and forth and being open to possibilities becomes more of a reality. one of the things that
You know what's so weird, Jared?
Yeah.
When you say it, it just sounds so sane. Do you know what I mean? So on paper, propositionally, you go, well, of course I'm open to possibilities. I mean, aren't we all? And then, but when you actually get into the nitty gritty of it, and it's a conversation over a Christmas dinner, and somebody's going to leave away offended, things change.
Yeah, that's being a pastor. That's what we sometimes had people who talked about controversial things from the pulpit, and as pastors, we got a lot of the backlash. And sitting over coffees over those hours, I came to realize that the issue is not really ever the issue. It's the relationships. It's those more core things to our humanity around how we relate, how we belong, how do we feel safe. And being safe, I think, is a big one because of the shift that Rollo May talks about in anxiety, that we're no longer afraid of getting eaten by a lion. Now we're afraid of these more abstract things, like not belonging to a social group, or losing my job over my views on God, or like these things that some are rational, some are irrational, and the anxiety is we don't know which is which, really.
Right.
And so how do we have concrete conversations? And I think as leaders we have to have the courage to step into that, because it's going to be awkward. We have to lean into the awkward and say, hey, and I've done this on several occasions, you're asking me about what happens if you believe in evolution. You're asking, is evolution true or not? I think the better question to start with is, if you changed your mind, what friendships would you lose, or what family members would you not get to talk to anymore?
Right.
Because I think that's dealing with more of the foundation. And then we can get to whether it's true or not. But we have this obsession with truth, and we think that if we're true, if we're right, it's somehow going to fix our heart or these relationships. And in my experience, that's never been true, or never been the case.
I love what you said about it's not the content, it's the container. And I think that's a really thoughtful and insightful thing to reflect on further, I think, for all of us, because, talk about having an impact on structure and point of view and perspective, and what are the, cleaning those lenses on my glasses, my philosophical glasses from time to time. What is it that makes up the container that is David Peck? And how does that now impact the way I love my wife and my friends and do the work I do overseas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Right.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that for me, the final implication for that is, if there's anything I take pride in, it is considering people all over the ideological spectrum, religiously, politically, as dear, dear friends who I love and would do anything for, and how having them feel the same way about me. And so, some of my closest friends are Southern Baptist pastors, and some are atheists, and some are, Emergent Village or progressives. And that's a metric for me of whether I feel like I'm moving in the right direction with my life. And so I appreciate hearing you say that, because that ties right into the container question is, am I being the kind of container, am I being a safe place for people to bring themselves fully, or am I cutting them off at certain points because I can't handle what they're going to bring? So,
Jared, thanks for joining us today. So Jared Byas has been with us today on Face to Face. He's the author of Genesis for Normal People with Peter Enns. You can find him all over the internet, frankly. You've got a lot of stuff going on. Jared Byas, check him out. He's got his own blog. He's on Peter Enns' website as well. He's a leadership consultant, and by the looks of it, according to Peter Enns, a really awesome guy.
Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining us today.